Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Buxbaum. I am now retired, but I taught at Queens College as part of the City University of New York for many years. And I'll speak a little bit more about my relationship with Carolyn later on after the program begins. I want to thank everyone here for attending, and I especially want to thank the organizers who helped me organize the program. And that means Alex, Betty, Faye, who will all be introduced, and Barbara. And I hope I'm not leaving anyone out as I scan the screen. We're going to have a list of speakers that were listed on the invitation, each speaking about Carolyn from their varied perspectives. And then we will open it up to comments from anybody who's attending wherever you are. The more, the better. But we'll do that after the presentation by the listed speakers. I'd like to begin then by introducing Faye Ginsburg. Many of you already know her, of course. Faye is the Kreiser Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Media, Culture, and History at NYU.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and everyone, and it's nice to gather today. Jonathan asked if I could help launch the event today with a land acknowledgement. I know there's a lot of debate about those, but it feels like it's the right thing to do, particularly given Carolyn's dedication to using her filmmaking and organizing talents to support and help represent the lives and concerns of Indigenous Australians. So with that in mind, I want to say that while people are joining us from all over the world, most of us are participating in today's event on the island of Manhattan, which is part of the unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape people, past, present, and future. Moreover, this land has long been a gathering place and home for a very wide range of First Nations people from across the globe who continue to live on this island. So we honor these legacies through this acknowledgement, which, like Carolyn's work, signals a concern with not only dismantling the ongoing harms of settler colonialism and racism, but also a commitment to showcasing the work and concerns of Indigenous people that have brought so many incredible forms of creativity to many of our lives. So with that said, I'm gonna speak about Carolyn and my relationship with her a bit. I'm really glad to be part of the gathering today to honor Carolyn's life and her work. And I just also want to express my gratitude to Jonathan, Betty Gordon, Alex Uhash, and Barbara Bowen, who worked to make this happen. I had the pleasure of knowing Carolyn for 40 years. I just did the math. That was many more years than I thought. But if memory serves, she came to New York for the North American premiere of her extraordinary film, Two Laws, which showed at the Margaret Mead Film Festival. I was working on the festival at the time. I had recently studied with Jean Rouch. I had made my first film and I had started doctoral studies in anthropology. I remember meeting Carolyn there. She was full of energy and enthusiasm, charmingly pugnacious and political, and with very short blonde hair. We immediately hit it off and the friendship continued for decades. She was a frequent dinner guest, particularly when my husband, Fred Myers, who's on this group today, and I had many Indigenous Australian friends visiting. When I started teaching at NYU in the late 1980s, I invited her to show Two Laws in my classes, such an incredible opportunity for students to be exposed to that, and also to larger audiences almost every year. Carolyn would show up with all 4 reels harnessed onto a wheeled cart, and we would carefully thread the 60mm projectors before the film was digitized. We also managed to have our children the same year and often ended up at film festival screenings and other events with kids in tow. In preparing for today, I managed to dig up notes that I have kept in my Carolyn's Strahan file, a paper file, starting with her comments about Two Laws in response to audience questions after the Mead Festival screening in 1982. When people asked about her method, she explained that, and I quote from my scribbled notes, "We just allowed Aboriginal law to dictate the film. It was then a piece of cake, the easiest filmmaking once we let go." I have notes from subsequent conversations when she talked about how in the Borroloola community where the film takes place, they held workshops, and I quote, "so that people learned the camera and how to work the projector and splice film. So people weren't in awe of it, they just thought of it as practical and they used it when they wanted to and walked away from it when they were done." The very simple but brilliant process of sitting down and showing people what effects different kinds of lenses or alternative camera angles might produce was, as far as I know, the first time anyone had bothered to do that with any Indigenous community, and to remarkable effect for, as evident for anyone who's seen the film. And even if you don't know any of that background and you watch the film, shot primarily with a wide angle lens that allows men and women, guardians and storytellers to be equally represented in the frame, you understand a very different point of view is being established and that this is a communally authorized text. For so many of us who were transformed by encountering two laws and Carolyn, the film offered a paradigm shift, not only about who gets to represent whom, but also how the very aesthetic structure of the film could be mobilized to communicate the radical alterity of another cultural world, including who has rights to tell stories, who gets to narrate history, and who should be included in the range of the camera, to name three prominent interventions. Carolyn was aware that two laws was prescient of what happened beginning in the last 2 decades of the 20th century with the rise of Indigenous media production in Australia and other parts of the world. Since the 1990s, I've been working with a lot of Indigenous Australian media makers from both remote and urban areas, many of whom have come through New York. Whenever they come, I always ask them, who would you like to visit? Who would you like to meet? And so many of them had seen two laws and had been profoundly influenced by that work and were eager to meet Carolyn when they learned she lived in the city. People like Katrina McKenzie, who we'll be hearing from soon. Carolyn always graciously met with these visitors, and she was eager to learn about their work, excited that they were doing the projects they were doing. And we often recorded remarkable conversations with them at NYU at the center. These intergenerational dialogues continue to be part of Caroline's enduring legacy that we are gathered to honor today. And I just want to express my thanks for all the gifts that Carolyn left for us in the world. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Alex Uhash, a distinguished professor of film at Brooklyn College and who is on the executive committee of Brooklyn College's union chapter. That's one of the capacities she represents today. She is also, I'm sure many of you know, a remarkable activist, filmmaker, and prolific author and delightful human being. So I'm turning things over to Alex now.
Thank you, Faye, and thank you to Jonathan and the rest of the organizing committee. I have what has felt like at once a very strange and also beautiful project. I was invited to speak by Jonathan, and I think it would be fair to say that I'm an outsider in certain ways to Carolyn, because I've never met her. And what I have experienced is getting to know this woman through these planning meetings, going back to watch the film, and thinking about what I can offer as someone in this room who is not here because she's a beloved or a colleague that I worked with or someone I learned from, but I know her in some other ways. And so I'm going to reflect on that. And I think, first of all, before I do that, there's something important here about if one is invited to a space that one is somewhat unfamiliar with, it is an honor. And it's an honor I took very seriously when Jonathan invited me to speak on behalf of your remarkable friend and family member and whatever other relations everyone else has in the room. So I'm going to share some brief remarks, having thought about what I do know about Carolyn, having never met her. I know her as a member of shared community. So I know many of you who love her, either because I know you personally or I know your work. I know her because I'm a member of the same union as her, the PSC CUNY. I know her because I'm a film professor and also the former chair of a film department at the City University of New York. And I know her because I am a scholar of feminist and activist media. And I think about that very seriously. And from these 4 positions, I'm going to reflect briefly about what I know and have thought about in relationship to her life and her legacy. So I think it's important to say that I'm either a full generation or like a half a generation or 1.5 generations away from many of you. Faye was my teacher. Faye is a beloved friend of Carolyn. I am now a teacher of people, you know, that are that sort of shift away. You all seemed very old and remarkable to me and wonderful, and like I could never be you from before. And part of what I'm reflecting on is how we make these beloved communities that are both our sort of age cohort and work cohort, and then how they open out to other people. So that where Faye was once my professor, Mark Nash was also my professor. He's going to come later. You know, I'm now in the beloved community. What is the beloved community? Oh, it's those of us who think very seriously about the leftist and radical potential of cross-cultural documentary and community-based production. And I am so grateful to be hailed into community with Carolyn. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from those of you who knew her. So that's the first way. I'm a member of a stretching community that's porous and invites in more people. Generation after generation, we find ourselves similarly open and hopeful for what we can do as scholars, as activists, as filmmakers. I know from listening to Jonathan and Barbara and many of the others in the room that she was a very active member of our union. I've only been in CUNY for 6 years. I joined the union the moment I came. I got onto the executive committee as soon as I could. I'm in the DA now. And I know that she is my comrade and that we share the struggle of labor and academic labor in this great university and this awful city, in the sense that it doesn't fund us properly, and that some of the best work we do in beloved community is with our leftist colleagues in struggle. So I know that because she's a member of my union and an active member. As a previous chapter of I came to Brooklyn College to chair the film department late in my career or mid-career, wherever I am. And I know that my best colleagues are adjunct faculty members. I know that because I've hired them and I've worked with them and I've observed them. I also know that they are exploited fundamentally at CUNY and in higher education. So I never met Carolyn, but I understand her work conditions. I also know how hard she must have taught, what a great teacher she must have been, even in these exploitative work environments that so many talented people are held in this corrupt and unjust environment that we work in today, the university. And that is why we are in the union. And so I know this about her. I also know how hard that is to live with that as your employment status and that miserable amount of money that people live on and all of that. So I know this as a chair, and I honor her work in our university, and I deplore that the university cannot support such remarkable artists and scholars. And again, that's why I'm active in our union. And finally, as a scholar of feminist and activist video and art, I know that women are not supported. Great women artists, great women filmmakers do not reach the prominence that they deserve and have not across the decades. And that must be true for Carolyn because it is a brilliant and important film, Two Lies, which I watched again to prepare. Paradigm shifting documentary, something that changed the ground around how those of us who followed, think about cross-cultural work, think about work in community, think about what it means to work in different cultural contexts, and that she did not make a second film, another feature, that her work was not properly funded, that her work was not seen as it should be, is a testament to the sexism and xenophobia and that organizes the film world to this day. And that is also very unfortunate, but true. And one of the things that I write about as a scholar is that for many very important women filmmakers, it is only in death and only in old age that they are supported as they should have been when they were 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. So they could have made the marvelous films that were behind and in front of them and in their heads, and that they had all the talent and desire to make. So she is one of many in that regard. However, we have her brilliant one film that I'm familiar with that is a legacy. So I will say to conclude, I went back to watch the film, and Faye had taught it to me when I was a graduate student. I didn't really remember that much about it. I sat in awe of it and this viewing. And what was so remarkable to me was that although I didn't exactly remember the film, I went on to make films like this. I went on in graduate school and hence to make activist films embedded in community where the people that I was in dialogue with, let's say, for instance, my doctoral film, AIDS, Women of Color in Brooklyn, making AIDS activist documentary together, in the vernacular, seeing the world as they saw it in partnership. So I didn't know that was Carolyn's legacy, but it had formed me. It was in me. And so I think what's important to remember for those of us who are teachers, for those of us who are filmmakers, for those of us who are in our own cohorts and maybe not in others, the effects of our work, of our voice, of our legacy, those are not easily mappable. You know, they're not obvious to chart. And yet Carolyn's work is very much in me, in a rigorous leftist experimental and political project that she embarked on, that I took up, my students take up with me, my comrades take up with me. And so, although I didn't know her, and it's an odd remembrance to remember someone you never met, I do know her. I know her through her work. I know her through her friends. I know her through the communities that we produce as we try and live the values that she embraced. And this I can tell you is true. And it's very moving to me to be able to express this to those of you who loved her. And it's very moving for me to be invited. And it's very moving for me to now hear your reflections on this remarkable woman's work. So thank you very much, Jonathan, and the committee as well.
Jonathan.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. So thank you very much, Alex, for agreeing to participate tonight. And thank you, of course, Faye, for your remarks. And I'd like to now introduce Betty Gordon, who is a filmmaker and also professor of film practice and film at Columbia University here in New York.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to talk just more personally about Carolyn. It's funny that we were both filmmakers. We talked a lot about other people's films, but not so much about our own. You know, somehow that always seemed maybe too formal or something. But I met Carolyn in 1982 when she arrived in New York City. My Australian husband, Tim Burns, introduced us, and we instantly connected. She and her partner, Alessandro, had just completed Two Laws, and I just finished shooting my first feature, Variety, and I was in the process of editing. And we bonded, of course, over the excitement of introducing our work to the film community. But really what's crazy is, I think back now, neither of us could have predicted the, let me say, immense, I hope, impact of both of our films, or that both of the impact that our films would have later on. So soon after meeting Carolyn, I offered to host a screening of Two Laws in my loft, which was on Greenwich Street. And it was a giant loft. And I invited friends, her friends, my friends, anybody who wanted to come. And I had a 16mm projector, my old little Kodak pageant. So it was in the room with us. we didn't have a lot of places to sit down, so we were all lying on pillows and whatever we could find on the floor. It was kind of amazing. Two laws offered us such a different way of seeing and hearing. It was so visually powerful. It blew my mind. Those long takes that went on forever invited us to sit on the ground, and we were already sitting on the ground, but not with the same kind of beautiful nature and everything around us, like the Borroloola people in the Northern Territory, we were witnessing their plans for a film that were made through their own eyes and through their own narrative traditions to tell us their story of resistance and struggle for land rights. That night in my loft, we all shared an incredible recognition that this film pushed past the boundaries of what we had known so far as documentary, and it challenged filmmaking practices, particularly the notion of objectivity, by privileging the Aboriginal community's perspective. And 2 hours and 20 minutes later, we were dying for a drink. We opened bottles of wine and we discussed the film into the night, into the morning, often as we did in those days with each other, just talking and drinking and dancing and celebrating life. And that night was special. It was just the beginning of my long and deep friendship. Carolyn was a complicated and exciting person. She was an Australian first, and she never let me forget that, and a New Yorker second, and I think she never let her Australian friends forget that. She was a professor, a teacher, a writer, a colleague, a union activist, a Marxist, and she never let us forget that, a radical thinker, a political activist, a feminist, a warrior, a believer in holistic medical practices. We sat for hours listening to her lectures about what we should eat, what we should take, what medicines we shouldn't take. She was a skeptic of institutional thinking, an adventurer, a world traveler, a lover of music, literature, and art. She was a deep thinker, often argumentative and stubborn as hell, passionate, but always committed to social change. She was a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, a partner, a friend, and a lover. God, she was all of those things all at once. Complicated, loving, loyal, and a badass, and one of my closest friends. We shared everything, stories, secrets, fantasies that women don't often even share with each other. Our families, our friends, our kids, our houses, our recipes, our work, our holidays, our sadnesses, anxieties, our happinesses. She always tried to convince me that she was right on any film we disagreed on. It's hard to kind of fight with her because she was so powerful, but I always did and I always tried. On 9/11, when it seemed like the world had gone crazy, living, especially as we both did, a block away from each other, we were desperate. We found each other. As the first thing we did, we found each other, and through the darkness, it was so damn dark down here, and the chaos, we clung to each other to find our way out of the neighborhood, carrying whatever we could, and of course with Harry and Lily by our sides. These days, I continually find myself reaching for the phone, as has been my practice for all these years, to tell Carolyn something funny or crazy. I'm sure you all have that experience. You want to tell the person something and you can't. Drives me crazy. Sometimes I want her advice. Sometimes I just need to cry or laugh. And then, of course, I realize I'm faced with the disappointment of that instinct. But I believe in a more metaphysical, I think actually she taught me how to believe in the metaphysical, because she always watched and believed in the Long Island, what do you call it? The Long Island metaphysical storyteller. You know, she could see the future just by hearing your voice, or if you were so lucky to be on the show, she would watch it religiously and always tell me that I needed to go on because she could tell my future. She really believed in that. And I think she convinced me finally that I should believe in it too. Gosh, she has, for me, a lasting connection. She is a feeling that I think I carry a part of her with me, and I am sure she's here today, right now. Her energy and her spirit are sitting in this Zoom. She's probably smiling. Maybe she's amused. She's probably a little critical of all of us. She knows we're thinking and speaking about her, and she's proud nonetheless of her legacy, of the films she made. She was in the process of trying to make a film about rats in Manhattan. Little did she realize how eventually the rats would take over, as they have now. And I still think we have some of the footage of that, which maybe we can put together at some point if I can find it. She's proud of the work that she's done, and she's proud of her friends, and she's proud of her family, especially of her family. She lived life as she chose to live it, no matter how much I argued with her about treatments for cancer, about the things that I wish she would do. She wouldn't. She lived an authentic life, a courageous life, an accomplished life, and I, for one, feel privileged that I was a part of it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Betty. I certainly recognize Carolyn from all of your remarks, especially her pugnaciousness and her being a badass, which I'll comment on in my remarks now. Before I begin, though, I want to share my screen because I have a few slides to show if I can succeed in doing this. And then I'll read some remarks. You can all see that picture of Carolyn?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Like some of the other speakers, I first met Carolyn in the early 80s, but I met her in the context of what was called Paper Tiger Television in the early 1980s, an informal group of media activists led by Dee Dee Halleck, organizing activist readings of mainstream media on a local cable station on 23rd Street. While a faculty member at Queens College, part of the public and once free City University of New York, I became active some years later in the insurgent caucus of the Union of Faculty and Professional Staff at CUNY, the Professional Staff Congress, or PSC, the union hosting this tribute. At the suggestion of and with the support of the new president of the PSC, Barbara Bowen, in 2001, the union formed a Labor Goes to the Movies committee to have monthly screenings on Friday at 6 p.m. at the Union Hall on Lower Broadway, at Wall Street, as it were, which I'm sure Carolyn appreciated. As activists within the PSC, the committee sought to promote organizing with what we conceived of as progressive screenings. Carolyn joined the committee after several years of operation and immediately began pushing her quite aggressive conception of the film series. For Carolyn, that meant designing yearly programs with clear pedagogical coherence within the constraint of a loose yearly theme, such as contesting Islamophobia or anti-racism. Coming to the meetings armed to the teeth with arguments and attitude, Carolyn's energy and will provoked at times sharp exchanges, often spiced with Carolyn's paranoia that committee members were conspiring behind her back to sabotage her impeccable programming vision. In the last group email I received from Carolyn, she referred to her, quote, spidey sensors, which were always functioning during our meetings. As I spent more time with Carolyn, eating dinner regularly at Edwards, her go-to restaurant a short walk from her apartment, I began to understand one of the sources of her paranoid anger. I realized that Carolyn was reacting in part to her frustration with her teaching as an adjunct in the CUNY system. As we know, higher education for decades now has been cutting costs by hiring adjuncts instead of tenure-track faculty, with contingent labor often responsible for teaching more than 50% or more of university courses, with few or none of the financial and academic protections enjoyed by full-time and especially tenured instructors. Being headstrong and feisty, certainly pugnacious, Carolyn bristled at her treatment of the adjunct trenches. Underpaid, of course, but more painfully, she felt her voice in the classroom was silenced by tenured superiors, and her intellectual labor at times expropriated for use by privileged full-time faculty. Hence her blurb for Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which she spoke about, opened with a pedagogic prelude, where she said, or she wrote, "As most of our students have grown up with high school genre movies, it seems appropriate to include one." She was very big on including popular genres, which she would then critique in a highly pedagogical manner at Labor Goes to the Movies. I believe those travails in academia actually intensified Carolyn's commitment to Labor Goes to the Movies. Frustrated intellectually at the university, Carolyn wanted Labor Goes to the Movies to be a more liberated expression of learning outside the classroom, part of the impetus behind Paper Tigers some 40 years earlier. But now that much more urgent in her own life as academia inexorably reduced her options in New York. Nonetheless, Carolyn pursued graduate work in Australia, receiving her master's degree at Macquarie University, if that's the right pronunciation, in 2017. And many of the voices tonight speak quite properly of the importance of two laws. But I noticed in her master's thesis that Carolyn said the following about two laws. "While my film reputation has been built on the critical success of Two Laws, a documentary, I was not committed to the pursuit of the, in quotes, purity of observational cinema as a goal in itself. I chose to focus on diverse voices and political change, and I would have chosen any form that would best serve the purpose." So she was hardly a purist in terms of the form, and that's part of the reason Two Laws, I think, is so successful and amazing, because it was a truly collaborative effort where she was able to listen, unlike what she did necessarily at our Labor Goes to the Movies meetings. In any event, Carolyn saw Labor Goes to the Movies, I think, as a union space offering her as an adjunct more freedom of thinking than the classroom. While I felt attacked by Carolyn more than once, quite unfairly, of course, I also welcomed and was stimulated by the dynamic and intellectual honesty behind her rage. Polemical and political to the end, Carolyn inspired all of us with her articulate passion. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the same Barbara Bowen, whom I referred to a moment ago, the intellectual author, as it were, of Labor Goes to the Movies, who is a professor of English at the City University of New York, and of course, for many years, the president of the Academic Labor Union at CUNY, the Professional Staff Congress. And I knew Barbara first because we were colleagues and comrades at Queens College together. So Barbara, I'm delighted that you're here tonight, and thank you for all your support during those years.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And it's such an honor to be here tonight, especially with dear friends of Carolyn and family. I feel very honored to be in this company. Also to have heard such trenchant analyses of Carolyn's work and her contributions. One thing that I love that's coming through the contributions, even though people knew her in different ways, there's the same Carolyn is emerging. The, what did Faye call her? Charmingly pugnacious, the adventurer, the aggressive stance in our meetings. It's the same charming, committed, serious, smart, dedicated, left person who comes through to all of us. And that's really a beautiful thing. So I first want to thank everyone who's joined us tonight, thank the speakers, the organizers, and especially Jonathan, who was for 20 years or so the organizer of Labor Goes to the Movies, our weekly, monthly, I wish it were weekly, our monthly series that the union ran. And as you've already heard, that Carolyn was a very committed participant in. And also Jonathan was our organizer for tonight, so thank you. Just to say a little bit more, it was also through Labor Goes to the Movies that I knew Carolyn. And I think what Jonathan said is very important about Carolyn's finding perhaps an alternative intellectual home in union activism. A union could be and should be a source of rethinking, not just our dollars and cents, not just our wages and hours, though it must be that too, but also rethinking how we conceive of the world, rethinking art, rethinking our relationship to work. And certainly being active in a union that is a striving union, I'll say that, transforms the way we understand the workplace. And the impetus of Labor Goes to the Movies was in conjunction with the thought about transforming the possibilities of labor unions, and specifically a union in the City University of New York, which has a history that has been broken now of free tuition, but a history of inclusiveness, again, always embattled, but it's a special place. It has striven to be, at least in its self-description, a place that is different from the purely capitalist adventure of higher education, mostly in this country. And we sought to make many things new, and one of them was our cultural work. Jonathan introduced us to the Latin American idea of third cinema, the sense of cinema not as something where one sits enthralled and identifies with the protagonist, but a more Brechtian experience where we can defamiliarize, we can stop the movie partway and start talking about it. We can go to a 6-hour movie and all be there together. We can bring in labor speakers and workers in the employment sectors that are being depicted in the series, and try to interrupt cinema as a purely consumer experience and make it something quite different, where the audience is also creating. And I think it's a tribute to Jonathan's work that Carolyn found that, and found that as a home, and was so active there. And it's especially appropriate, I think, to be honoring Carolyn at this point, a moment of where activism in the Academy has, I think, begun to take a new turn. And I think it's also an important point, and I hope our Australian colleagues will speak about this, but my understanding is that it's an important point in Australian Aboriginal history with the referendum coming up on the voice to Parliament, a statutory or beyond statutory constitutional inclusion of a voice in the Australian Parliament. And one thing that struck me there was how the proponents and the advocates of that movement, which maybe we'll hear a little bit more about, have used film to engage others and to make the whole Australian population feel together engaged in that. I think Carolyn would love to have seen that. It's also a very important moment in the United States. There are 2 big strikes going on of adjunct faculty. One's in California, one's right here in New York at the New School. We can all support those. That, I think, would be a fitting thing to do in tribute to Carolyn. So I hope that this event can remember her, but I know that she would have been the first one out on those picket lines, and I hope that we can do that. So I just want to say a little bit before I stop about what several of you have talked about, Alex, so powerfully, and Jonathan and others, how we had in Carolyn this incredibly prominent, important, influential filmmaker. And there she was, largely unrecognized in her department, unheralded, and maybe not quite invisibilized, but we all lost as a university the chance to benefit as much as we could have from her intellectual and cultural work. And that's a tragedy, and it's going on still. I think Alex was right when she said there are hundreds, thousands of stories, histories, contributions waiting to be made and being abused by a university system that doesn't pay enough attention to everyone who studies there and everyone like Carolyn who works there. That Carolyn was so pedagogical, as Jonathan said, and fierce in her work in Labor Goes to the Movies, I think was related to the way she did not have the opportunities she should have as in her academic work. I never knew till tonight that the fierce commitment to having a unified year-long program for the whole series was Carolyn's architecture. I did hear the voices in those meetings where I would hear intense arguments for hours and hours, and felt Carolyn's very strong voice guiding us all. It really mattered to her. And that was one of the things that I loved most about her. We could see that Carolyn was struggling with illness. I didn't know her deeply and intimately, but I could see she was struggling with serious illness. And yet she was there. She never missed a meeting. She never missed coming to anything. And she never wavered in her intensity, even when she was struggling so much with her own health. She was a model to me as a woman, to me as somebody who believes that activism can be a place for cultural work. It is cultural work. To me as somebody who wants to keep changing our university, which has, I think, more potential than others, but is under fiercer attack than most, and rethink, just as we tried to rethink what showing a movie could be in a labor context, to try to learn from Carolyn's experience, both good and bad, how we might rethink bringing in the contributions of everyone with whom we work and with whom we teach. There are many, many people who are not seen and not valued. Many of them are women, many of them are older, many of them are people of color. Many of them are working on issues of resistance and anti-racism, and we must see them. So I just want to say that I'm so grateful to all of you for being here, to Carolyn, wishing that I had known her better, listening to all of you, wishing that I had maybe paid more attention, not only to her fierceness, her argumentativeness, her left voice, her self-confidence, which I admired very much, but also to her work and her teaching. So tonight, I hope we can continue that teaching or work and thinking and love of beauty, which Carolyn also had. So it's a pleasure to be in her union, to have known her, and to have felt month by month the intensity and the value of her work. I'm her beneficiary. So thank you all.
Thank you, Barbara. Faye, do you want to introduce?
So I'm seeing that I'm next in line to introduce Mark Nash and Isaac Julian, who were very close friends of Carolyn's and very involved in her life up to the end. But I am not seeing them on that. It looks like they haven't joined. I know how committed they were to coming, but I don't see them here. So let's just put that off, and hopefully they'll join us. It's already close to midnight in England, where they currently are. Isaac just got knighted by the new king. So I know they were huge supporters of Carolyn, and I am surprised they haven't joined on, but maybe the time difference in any case. So I think we should just move along. Thank you, Jonathan. If I see them hopping on, I'll give you a hands up.
Okay, that's great. Betty, perhaps you can continue then with the introductions.
Okay, well, I'm going to introduce my dear colleague, Rosalind Morris, who is a professor of anthropology at Columbia University. She's a cultural theorist, a prolific author, a filmmaker, her most recent film, We Are Zama Zama, which focuses on the lives of South African migrant mining workers excavating in the country's abandoned gold mines in South Africa, premiered at the South African Encounters Festival, and Zama Zama Idea Installation Project premiered at the Berlinale. I'm so proud of this film. I love this film. I've seen it many times, and I can't wait to see it shown in New York. Roz also is a poet and a librettist, and I had the pleasure of attending her chamber opera this summer, sponsored by Barnard, called Southern Crossing. So Roz, there's so much more to say. I brought Carolyn to a party at Roz's house one night, and I think Carolyn was very excited to meet Roz, and Roz to meet Carolyn. So at least, we had that crossover, all of us together at your house, Roz. So I would love to hear anything that you would have to say.
Thanks, Betty. I'd like to start by offering my deepest, most sincere condolences to Carolyn's family and friends. Unlike many of you, I did not know Carolyn well. Betty has just told you the story of our meeting. But I wanted to be in community with those of you who, like others here, were touched by her and who responded to her provocations, her solicitations, her offerings. Like many who knew Carolyn well, her work has been enormously important for me as an example of a kind of engaged filmmaking that has the capacity to change the way we see and listen to others, the way we learn from others rather than about others. But I wanted to use my little time here to share a brief reflection on the last time that I taught that inimitable film, Two Laws. It was June 2020, in the context of a course on experimental cinema and ethnographic practice. And we were in the early stages, I said to myself, in the midst, and I'm not sure, I don't know what that means anymore. We were in the midst of the pandemic and in the first blush of enraged protest following the murder of George Floyd. And my class, which had begun as usual, had been such a source of mutual sustenance during the first months of lockdown as we went into Zoom land, that we decided to continue it into the summer with an extended community of students and filmmakers that stretched from Brazil to Italy. And it was in that context that I asked people to watch the film. I wasn't sure how students of that generation, or this generation, with their famously short attention spans and very little exposure to Aboriginal forms of narration, would react. And they were awed, as was I when I first saw the film, by the daring of its method. And I should note here that when I first saw it, it was alongside the 1975 film Potlatch, A Strict Law Bids Us Dance by Dennis Wheeler and Dorothy Cranmer Webster, a film from the Quadroth community of the Northwest. So something was in the air, in the idiom of the law. But then if you've seen Two Laws, you know that there are many routes to revolution. In 2020, my students were moved, as was I, by the poignant and painful resonance between the predicament of the people speaking from Borroloola and the Black and Indigenous subjects of legal violence in the US. But they were also challenged by the radical distance in conceptions of voicing and testimonial that also challenged, they were also challenged by the radical distance in conceptions of voicing and testimonial that also intrudes between these worlds. And if, as Fred Mars, who's here, I know, said in 1982, the film was revolutionary enough to precede its ideal audience, its radicality is no less palpable today. In the almost syncopated cadences of the film's editings, my students found themselves challenged to think the differences between law and legalism, to think of rights beyond class-protected litigiousness, and to contemplate sovereignty without leadership. I watched the film again today and was enchanted again by that incredible moment in part 4 when one woman says to another laughingly, "I love you, I'm going to dream you tonight." But of course, that moment of love punctuates a story of grief and loss and death. And you'll know that the digital version of the film, which of course was not intended and which was resisted for a very long time, you will know that the digital film, or the digital version of the film, if one can even say that, opens with the usual FBI warning, and then is followed by a second gesture in which viewers are warned that they will hear of the dead and that this may cause sadness. And that was an extraordinary thing to encounter today. Two laws, then and now. In June 2020, I found myself astonished by a strategy of reenactment that had no aspiration to naturalism, but that could concentrate in the single abstracted gesture of slowed down beating the whole history of state violence against First Nations, Aboriginal, and Indigenous peoples. And today, as then in 2020, when the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's death made all time stand still and to dilate unbearably, the slowness of the film called to me as an invitation to claim the time of judgment from the drive to instantaneity that is a corollary of video's imbrication with war making in the digital age. And of course, Caroline and Alessandro's 16mm film was not made in the mode of video, even if today, and certainly in the context of Zoom class instruction, students experience it in that form. But the ethical and formal revolution of that film seems to me to remain palpable, even in its digitized reformatting, and that is extraordinary. That fact alone is testament to its revolutionary intervention. And so I dare to recall it here for people who know it very well. Even if most of you, all of you, know what I've said already, and it will come as nothing new. For in sharing together what we know collectively, individually, and serially, what we know of Caroline's gift, we recite without repeating, testify without exhausting that gift. And that was the lesson of narration in two laws, that one could repeat without reducing the testimony of the one who has also spoken their grief. So to Caroline, if she is in the room, in whatever way she is, I would like to say what I never was able to say to her in person, which is thank you. And to you all, I say, isn't it extraordinary, even beautiful, that we can say this, thank you, again and again, to and with each other.
Betty, do you want to continue? I mean, thank you, Roz, of course, for your remarks. Betty, do you want to introduce the next speaker? Or, yes, she's here.
Okay, Pat, you're here. Thank you. I just saw Pat here in New York City with Sandy, who's here. We were good friends when we met really just recently. What was it, like a week ago or 2 weeks ago? We met at Carolyn's house, which was really difficult for all of us. We'd all been there for years. And I had walked there every day for a year, not every day, but a lot of days during the week. And the first thing I encountered, of course, was the bed in which Carolyn resided and was unable to move hardly up or down or left or right. And so we were all, and Sandy and Pat, Irene and Debbie were there, and we didn't know what it would be like to be there without Carolyn. So again, of course, the Long Island madam who she talked about was there in her metaphysical way, and Carolyn was there. And so I'm happy to introduce Pat now, who has been such a long time friend of Carolyn from Australia and beyond, of course, from US as well. Pat is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, producer, director, prominent member of the Australian independent filmmaking community, the Co-op, and so much more, and herself a winner of the Australian Film Institute's award for Best Documentary for one of many films she made for all the world to see. So Pat, we would love to hear a few words from you.
Thank you, Betty, and it's really lovely to be included in this lovely tribute for Carolyn. I have to state that I'm actually American, And and I went to Australia in 73 to Melbourne, and ended up in Sydney. The 72 I went to Melbourne, 73 I ended up in Sydney, and learned about the Blinky Bill Film Workshop at the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op. And it's where I fell in love with filmmaking and got involved with the co-op and met a huge number of people there, including Carolyn and Alessandro. I came to know them and their work and was more than a little awed by them. They were articulate, outspoken, inspiring, deep thinkers. They're a little bit scary, actually, but I really came to know them, and it was lovely. And their work, of course, lives on. Just recently in Australia, Ningla Ana, which was directed by Alessandro, but Carolyn had quite a good involvement in it as well towards the post-production. And it just has been recently restored and had a cinema run and a television screenings in Australia. So, they were amazing filmmakers. And over the time I got to know Carolyn, and I got close to her, and even more so when she moved to New York. I was going back to the States every year, as my parents in Minneapolis were not well. And I'd always go to New York and most often stay with Carolyn in the loft. And we'd go for long walks along the Hudson River. We would talk late into the night, particularly about politics, feminism, unionism, our work. We hung out in coffee shops, drank at the Tin Pan Alley, as some of you will remember the Tin Pan Alley, no doubt, a dungeon bar near Times Square. I was with her on a wild night when she met Vinny at the Tin Pan Alley, her future husband and father of Harry, of course. Carolyn was actively involved with others, and I think it's what has been talked about before in setting up film screenings in New York. I didn't really know the history of it, but it was, there were interesting and controversial films. And I remember so many exhilarating discussions and debates afterwards. She would often talk about her teaching, which she loved and was so good at, and complained about the institution, like some of you have mentioned. And I've read some of her students' wonderful assessments about her. It's, I thought, I wouldn't mind being a student of Carolyn's. I always enjoyed my time with her in New York. And when she came back to Australia to visit, and a couple of years ago, I became the go-between when Carolyn got sick and couldn't always respond to the tons of emails she was getting. As you know, she had bone cancer from 9/11 debris, as she lived so close to the Twin Towers, and Betty mentioned that. And she suffered from so much pain, but she outlived every prognosis that she ever had. But she would send me updates, beautifully written. Her writing was so divine. I loved getting them. And she also had a wicked sense of humor and irony. And I would send it out to a long list of her friends here in Sydney, in Australia, in the US, and all over the world, really. She was well loved, Carolyn. And I felt privileged to be doing this for her. And Carolyn really loved the Bouquets of Australian Flowers, our big group, sent her every week during her illness. And we all, she would wax lyrical about the flowers that she received, and it was amazing. She wanted to be buried under a gum tree back in Australia, and she told people, she mentioned that to a lot of people. So when she did die, Harry flew back to Australia with her ashes. it was so good to see and hug him again and just be with him. And so with Harry, with her sister Jeanette and family and many of her close friends in Sydney, we buried her under a sugar gum, an Angophora, and a Banksia. We thought that would cover it all. She was buried in a reserve near Whale Beach with a gorgeous view overlooking the Pittwater and the bays and boats, and it was gorgeous. And it was near where she lived for 4 years in the early 70s in a communal house, and where they all often gathered to watch the sunset. This day was very special, and we all felt that we'd done her proud. We also were able to organize a 2 Laws screening at the Antenna Documentary Film Festival in Sydney as a tribute to Carolyn, which was introduced by Helen Grace and followed by a wonderful panel discussion with Jason DeSantolo, Lisa Stefanoff was here, and Iqbal Barquette. Iqbal was her supervisor for both her master's and her PhD. And today it's really, like I said before, it's really special to be involved in this tribute to Carolyn. I hope we have many more. I was recently in New York, as Betty said. Sandy Edwards, of course, was there. And we had planned our trip so that we would be in New York at the same time to spend time with Carolyn. But that was not to be. She died 2 months before we were coming. I stayed at the Loft this time in New York, and the first couple of days, like Betty said, were very hard for me. And then all of these fabulous memories of her came flooding back. And we had a dinner together there, and we chatted a lot. And I felt that it was pretty cathartic for us all. And Sandy and I were able to hang out with Betty, Debbie, Sandy, and Irene. And Vinny and his partner, Kayo, of 20 years, with Joe, Carolyn's long-term partner, and Harry. Harry just for a short time, as he works such odd hours and sleeps so much of the day. But spending time with them all was wonderful. And New York will never be the same without Carolyn, but always have those fabulous memories. Farewell, Carolyn. I so miss you in my life.
Jonathan, I think I'm going to read Katrina's comments. Thank you so much, Pat. That was just really extraordinary. And it's so great you could join us. I have the privilege actually of, I was hoping Katrina McKenzie would be able to join us, but she's actually on a shoot in Vancouver, which you'll hear about in a moment. So she did send me her text to read to you all. So I'm going to do that. From my own introduction of her, Katrina McKenzie comes from the Kaurna people of Southeastern Australia, and she is a very well-known Indigenous Australian filmmaker whose first feature, Satellite Boy, had its North American premiere in 2012 at the Toronto International Film Festival. She's done actually a lot of wonderful short films before that. In 2018, she founded her own production company, Dark Horse, which she hopes will be a vehicle to provide opportunities for new diverse voices. And she's been working actually mostly out of the West Coast, Los Angeles, and now in Vancouver. She believes that there are hundreds of stories to be told, and I quote, about the impact of white colonial Australia on Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal people. Katrina first met Carolyn in 1997 when she came to New York to study screenwriting at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts with Paul Thompson. And I was actually describing her interest in meeting Carolyn in my remarks. And I actually just found an interview that Carolyn and Katrina did, and also one that Lisa and Carolyn did. So we have some treasures that I've just been digging into, which I'd be happy to share. So here's what Katrina said. I'd flown into New York City from Central Australia. I was used to not seeing people. Manhattan was something else. It was like cognac. Koyaanisqatsi, which actually means life out of balance. People everywhere. It was exciting and it was overwhelming for me. I was there to study filmmaking at NYU Tisch. As an aside, on the plane, I had been slipped a hash brownie, but I didn't know. And I love chocolate, and I was recovering from being very sick, not just stoned, but in the hospital sick. So I was a bit fragile, but in walks Carolyn. Let's go for a walk, she said. Walking was the very last thing I wanted to do, but she won me over. And so I walked my way around Manhattan with her. I could feel how comfortable she was in her skin. I watched her navigate the landscape of New York City with so much grace. She was very present with me, generous in the sea of madness, and she was so calm. And I started to relax and open up and see the possibilities of the city and of the country. It's a rare gift when someone can help you to dream bigger. Carolyn gave me that gift. I could see in her the respectful insight and advocacy that she had brought to making two laws with the community. She had a wise eye for the world and an expansive heart. It's a very deep gift to inspire a dream, and that is what she did for me. I'm very sorry I can't be there. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, working on an ABC, that is Australian Broadcast Corporation, primetime drama about missing Alaska Native women. We all provide the shoulders that hold up those who will come after us. I am so grateful to Carolyn for being that and to being such an advocate for Indigenous stories to be told. And Harry, your mom was a legend. If you need anything, let me know.
I don't know if our last speaker now is the real badass herself, Deborah Zimmerman. I think you are, unless Mark or Isaac shows up. Those of you who know Debbie or who don't, she is the executive director of the media arts organization Women Make Movies. She's world renowned. She's been speaking on independent film distribution and marketing and financing for a long time. Her experience is so valuable. She's also a recipient of the New York Women in Film and Television Lorene Arbus Award and Hot Docs Mogul Award, given to those who have made essential contributions to the creative vitality of the documentary industry. She's our friend, and I admire her enormously, and she will tell us her life with Carolyn. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Betty. I so wish Isaac and Mark were here so I wouldn't be last, but I'll try to do it. You know, it's so interesting that Faye started this, Alex started this with this sense of community, because I didn't know Alex. I was surprised when I saw Alex here because I had this feeling that Alex didn't know Carolyn, so it was kind of odd to me, but it really is this unbelievable community. I know so many of you through many, many different ways, through Women Make Movies, through Carolyn, through personal, through professional, through academia, through being in awe of and being a student of in many ways, as well as now maybe even a mentor. But I actually met Faye when she made that first film, which Women Make Movies distributed, called In Her Hands, which most people don't know. So I'll just throw that out as a little kind of weird thing. I met Carolyn because of all of those fierce, fabulous, amazing Australian women who have played an incredible role in my life and in Women Make Movies life. You know, when Margot Nash and Megan McMurtry and Helen Grace walked in my office in the 1980s, I was just awestruck. I was like, where did these women come from and how unbelievably feminist their films are? And it actually was kind of predating a lot of films in the US because they were really fierce. Though I can't speak today without invoking and honoring Julia Reichert, who passed away a couple of days ago, who is a pioneering, amazing, who was a pioneering, amazing feminist filmmaker, American filmmaker. Anyway, they would come to my office wearing great jewelry and looking fabulous and with these amazing films, and I fell in love with them. And because of them, I met Mitzi Goldman, who had made Snakes and Ladders, another Australian filmmaker who now runs Documentary Australia, who brought me to Carolyn's. And it was the year that Harry was born. And that started a friendship that lasted, as many of you, 30 years or more. I don't know, how old is Harry? But it was truly an honor and a privilege to know Carolyn. For those of you who were there to spend all of those Thanksgivings and Christmases and Academy Award parties, and to argue with her and to listen to her and to just have that that experience that all of you have shared. I don't want to repeat what everybody said, but I will say that she started making that film that, I guess, I don't know who mentioned it, the Rats film. Betty,
Yeah.
Betty, you talked about the Rats
Definitely.
film. But I went back in our records and she started making it in 1993. It was a sponsored project of Women Make Movies. It was called Rats, Rain, and New Yorkers. It's called Drowned Rats, actually, Drowned Rats, and it was about rats, rain, and New Yorkers. And God damn it, she did not stop working on that film. She would go inches every year, but she would continue. In 2004, she actually got a grant finally from New York State Council on the Arts, and she refused to give up. Even in her last year, she was committed to trying to finish the film. And I've worked with hundreds, thousands of filmmakers. I don't know very many that had that kind of commitment over so many years to not giving up. She didn't give up. I want to read something actually, because she's not here. And Pat, wonderful Pat, who was such an amazing friend to Carolyn, sent it to me. And I wanted to just bring this around back to Carolyn and her family, because her family was really, really important to her. Harry was everything. But Harry's wife, Liz, wrote a beautiful thing about Carolyn that I wanted to read. It's just one small part. When I spoke to Carolyn, she really listened to me. She never forgot anything. She made me feel like I mattered, and I know how much all of you mattered to her. Her friends and her family were her world to her, along with her cherished son, Harry. I'm thankful she brought Harry into this world and that he has taken on so many of her amazing qualities. I'll always remember her striking beauty, her strength, her honesty, and her unique and hilarious sense of humor. I wish she was still here, and I'm determined to keep her alive through telling stories to her grandson and keeping photos displayed around the house. I just felt like I was so moved by that, by so many other things that she said. And I just felt that it made sense for me, from Women Make Movies, to honor her as a woman filmmaker and as a mother and as a grandmother. And I too cherish everything that she left behind. And I thank you all for all your beautiful, beautiful words about our dear, wonderful Carolyn, who we'll never forget. And thank you for those of you who organized this.
Thank you, Debbie. Long time.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank everyone who agreed to speak initially tonight. And as I said at the very beginning, which was some time ago now, we wanted to invite anybody who's here to speak. If you have anything you'd like to say in the tribute to Carolyn, you're all more than welcome. We're not rushed. And if you raise your hand, I believe that then we can take you in the order that you raise your hand if you choose to speak. So feel free to do so if you like. When I said raise your hand, I realized that's a little ambiguous. I saw a hand go off literally, but I was referring to your digital hand. However, The first physical hand I saw was Lisa's. So maybe I'll ask Lisa to speak, and maybe Alex, you can help unmute her. And if you could introduce yourself first. We're not hearing you yet, Lisa. Thank you for attending.
Thank you so much. And it's just been absolutely delightful to be here. It's a Saturday morning in the Central Desert. You know, we all have our misgivings about Zoom, but there's just enough of us that I can sort of see everyone at once. And many of you I know, some of you I don't know, some of you have been my teachers, my friends over many years, and colleagues. And I do like this particular Brady Bunch configuration, to see you all there, and particularly to note how many women are here. The sorority was so strong around Carolyn over many years, and for the male colleagues here who are also here, Fred, one of my teachers, people who respected and wrote very well about Carolyn. Just to see all of you here is just fantastic. I thought I might, and I think I put up my hand quickly because I think this follows from what Debbie said in her comments. I just wanted to offer a few comments from what I shared in Sydney in October at the great event that Dear Pat organised. And this is maybe tunes in with what Katrina was saying, the looking backwards and the looking forwards through generations. Carolyn lived with a very close sense that her own history had an intimate relationship with the greater violent reality of the society in which she had grown up with white privilege. In Therese Davis and Cassie Plate's 2008 piece in the Two Laws dossier of Studies in Documentary Film, Volume 2, Number 2, and in a related publication in 2020 called Screening the Past, and elsewhere, Carolyn explained her personal motivations in her filmmaking in a way that she didn't in the earlier interviews when she was part of the co-op. So I'm going to quote from Carolyn here, and I'm drawing from two sources. And she said, "When I was growing up, we had a painful family secret. My grandmother was part Aboriginal. This secret and my grandmother's fierce denial of it cast a long shadow over our family. Her fierce humiliation of being labelled Aboriginal made me want to redress that situation and make her proud of who she was. This was part of my passion. I so wanted to be part of a national movement that challenged the legitimacy of white settler culture and its policies of dispossession. I wanted to redress the humiliations suffered by my grandmother." And as we know, Carolyn was a fiercely dedicated single mother with a brown-skinned only child son in a wild city, as Katrina noted, and it wasn't always easy. And it wasn't always easy for her to return home here to Australia because of financial constraints often, very often, as often as she could, to spend time with her mother, her sister, and her Australian friends. And she often spoke to me of her longing for embodied sensory connection to this part of the world, to the sounds and the scents of country. And years before online streaming was a reality, I'd bring back to New York CDs of bird calls that I'd buy at the Australian Geographic shop in Sydney for her. And she'd recall the aromas of the bush in the heat and after rain. She even missed things like the intimacy of delousing hair with her Borroloola sisters, heads in laps, hands on scalps. In 2003, Carolyn and Harry visited me here in Mbantua, and they also travelled to Broome. And I have a beautiful image from that trip, and it was taken under a thin, shining ghost gum that grows out of the rock face at Quadatuma, or Ormiston Gorge in Georgia. Carolyn is sitting with Harry in her lap, just beaming with warmth, and also a kind of grounded peace, with a little wonder. And her happiness at being back in the land with her son, co-sensing a moment of their shared and different histories and futures. And I would just close by saying I've learned from Fred and Faye and many other of the Jewish friends I have in New York that as we fondly remember her and consider all the good work that she was a part of, may her memory truly be a blessing. Thanks. It's so great to be here.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad that you could make it. I see now moving to the digital hands, Marcia Newfield has volunteered to speak. And Marcia, perhaps you could begin by introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm a friend of Caroline's from the Labor Goes to the Movies at the PSC. We were both in that committee, and she always saved a seat for me, and we always went. And at the meetings, she often called on me as another feminist to back her up, because she felt that somehow the men on the committee weren't quite getting it. But I just know that I'm also was a grievance counselor at the union. And I was very aware of Carolyn's predicaments as an adjunct, particularly in the last years, where I felt that she was totally disrespected by the school where she taught a lot. And I was so angry, and I felt I tried to intervene, but there was very little that I could do. And it was really overwhelming. And yet, you know, she carried on, but it was very difficult. I mean, she had a difficult living situation as well, but I agree that she treasured Harry and the baby, and she did everything to keep them in her life. And you know, even when she was starting to be ill. Also, I want to thank Pat Fisk for keeping us informed all these years. It was really very valuable to me. And it's in Carolyn's memory. I don't know. It's just, she's among the vast amount of people in the world who are not properly compensated, who don't get a living wage. That's what it comes down to. All of us, you know, whether you're railroad or adjunct or, I don't know, cook. It's just, this is our collective world. And I think everything that we can do to try and change that is in Carolyn's memory.
Thank you, Marcia. I'd like to now call on Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Pilevsky, and I've known Carolyn, well, I remember meeting her when Harry was a baby, but we really got to know each other when her son and my son went to boarding school together. And this wasn't just a regular boarding school. This was a very intense opportunity for us to really bond and with our children and with each other as New York City parents. And we would, you know, we had a lot in common because of our film backgrounds and also because of our teaching backgrounds and because we were parents of children at the same school who happened to bond with each other as well. So we would go on these retreats that were outrageous. They were ridiculous. They were called meditation retreats. And all we could do was laugh, you know, because some of them were so silly. They were designed to help us and help our children, but they were flawed. And as Jonathan had said, there were sharp exchanges and we enjoyed those. And as a result, we really came to be part of the same family. And one of the things that I came to learn very quickly is that Carolyn lived what she believed. She didn't just say things, she really did. She was an activist and she fought like a tiger, like a lion, like a bear for her son. And she never let go. She was going to make sure that he succeeded no matter what anybody said. And she really served as an example for many people because she just would never give up. And as so many of you have said here tonight, that was part of what she did no matter what she did. But with Harry, it was incredibly meaningful. And as a result, of course, we all also became part of the Thanksgiving and Christmas family. And that was really beautiful. And she worked till she was exhausted preparing these lovely and special, memorable events for everybody. And it was wonderful. And I have tons of pictures that I'd love to show you of her a plum pudding that was set ablaze every Christmas, and everybody just celebrated. She was very proud and confounded by her son. But one of the things I love most is if we went out for a drink, or if she took me to a movie, because one of the things that she loved was getting free tickets. And so if she had a free ticket, she'd just haul you along with her. You know, she was just amazing at making sure that you were informed the same way she was. And we would just often be able to also turn everything around and laugh at some of the unpleasantness. And it was her dry and formidable sense of humor that just was amazing. So I thank everybody who's here. And it's just been, you know, an inspiration to have known her. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I see in the note that Lisa made a comment about the possible availability of the recording. I assume that it'll be successful, maybe wrongly assuming, but assuming that we do have a recording, I would want to share it with everybody here tonight. I'm not sure the best way to do it. If you remember, or if you have a copy of the invitation, I think my email may be on there to allow people to request the link to the film.
Put
So
your
if you
email in the chat. Put your email in the chat.
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Jonathan, it's Alex.
Yes.
Jennifer Deegan is next. Her hand is down, but she was next in the queue. Just wanted to let Jennifer Deeger was the next speaker.
Thank you, Alex. Well, why don't we move directly to Jennifer, and I'll put my email in the chat right now.
Jennifer, you're muted.
I know, I keep unmuting. Anyway, that goes
We
to
hear
the
you now.
machine is letting me speak now. So I'm Jennifer. I'm an anthropologist who works on collaborative co-creative filmmaking with Aboriginal people in North Australia, in Arnhem Land, which is same but different to Borroloola in many ways. I hesitated about putting my hand up at this point because I found myself strangely undone when Pat said that Carolyn ashes at Whale Beach, because that's where I grew up. And this connection, and that's where I'm going at Christmas. And that's this connection to a sense of Australianness and home, and the way in which Carolyn embraced me when I met her in New York, having been this fierce figure in my mind and informing my practice over many years, since I saw Two Laws when I first started my PhD, wondering, driven by my own question of how might Aboriginal people with cameras in their hands make video that express something about how the world is and matters to them. So Carolyn was a figure for me for a long time before I met her. And what was so special was when Faye introduced me to Carolyn. It was the way that she grabbed my hand literally and figuratively and drew me into her world, the world of New York, introduced me to people and put me completely at ease, because I feel like there was a sense in which Faye described the moment when the cameras were set up and everything was there and it was a piece of cake. I think Carolyn and I understood in a particular way, but of course all filmmakers will know what it takes to get to that piece of cake moment and what it takes to hold the possibilities for what can happen in those moments to continue to be made meaningful for the people with whom you're participating, for the people who open their worlds to you, and what it means to take to help take those moments out into the world. So yeah, at Christmas, I want to go and visit Carolyn and thank her for that and for so much more. And being here today and listening to everyone speaks makes me realize how much that first viewing of Two Laws has shaped my life, continues to inform my own questions and struggles and pursuit of piece of cake moments. So yeah, thanks. It's beautiful to be here.
Thank you, Jennifer. I see next up is Rosemary.
Hey, hi, I'm Rosemary Hochschild. I met Carolyn at the Edinburgh Film Festival in 1982. I saw her movie and I was in New Wave Cinema. And afterwards there was a party and I think we drank a hell of a lot of Glenfiddich together and we danced and kissed each other the night away. And then we came back to New York City and that's when I really got to know her and Betty. And, you know, I didn't really know very strong feminist intellectuals coming from South Africa. And the film had also really affected me too, coming from South Africa, seeing it. And she was just like a fantastic friend to me. And I've known her for 40 years. And it's so great to hear everybody speak of her in this way, of her passion, as well as her toughness and her dedication to what she did. So yeah, that's all I got to say. I love Carolyn.
Thank you, Rosemary. And I see also Will has his hand up.
Thank you. I'm Will. I'm not a film person. I'm married to a film person. She spoke a little while ago. But we knew, or I knew Carolyn as a friend, as Harry's mom, and as our hostess for I don't know how many countless Christmas days. And also I knew her film Two Laws, which as a non-film person I saw, and the first time I saw it, I realized this is something that's very different, fundamentally different way of telling the story of people. Carolyn also introduced us to an English tradition. Pardon me if you're a member of the Commonwealth and you don't like being called inheriting English traditions, but she introduced us to a Christmas pudding. And last, I believe it was Thanksgiving, my wife Stephanie can correct me, I made a Christmas pudding and it was called the Carolyn Strahan Memorial Christmas Pudding. Just before this Zoom meeting started, I started getting the ingredients together for this year's Carolyn Strahan Memorial Christmas pudding. And I realized when you serve the pudding, you light a flame. And that's going to be Carolyn. She's going to enter our house as a flame. And, you know, my son Casey, our son Casey, and Harry grew up together. And these are quintessential, prototypical, the progeny of New York City left-wing intellectuals who are allowed to roam the city, to experience the grandiosity of New York, the variety and diversity of New York, and at the same time to be almost marinated in the diversity of New York City culture. They also know Lily. So that's really all I have to say. I'm just looking forward. We have to wait, I guess, almost until Christmas to allow this English creation to, I don't know, mature, and then we light the flame. And it will be Carolyn, I know it. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. And I'd like to welcome Jill Goodmallow, who just came to the tribute. I met her once when Carolyn brought her to Labor Goes to the Movies. And if you would like, Jill, we're listening to anybody who would like to speak about Carolyn with no obligation to do so. And I'm now going to call on Sandy, who's had her hand up. And thank you for coming. You're muted, Sandy.
Mute. Okay, done it. Can you see me now? Hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. This has been very emotional for me. I've shed a few tears during the period of this memorial, and I am totally in awe of what everybody has said, and it just cements a lot of things for me. And it's kind of been interesting being one of the Australian friends of Carolyn. I met Carolyn much as Pat Fisk did in the early days of the Filmmakers Co-op and the feminist movement in Sydney. And I was a photographer, and my way of hanging out with everybody was to have my camera and document all the events. And I was a bit shy, but the camera helps you become unshy. And now I've got these amazing photographs that record our relationships. I started coming to New York, and as Pat did, and I also want to acknowledge Pat enormously in this tribute, because she has been the heart of keeping all of our Australian friends part of what's been happening with Carolyn and feeling close to her. And she's organized, you know, the flowers and everything. Many people actually supported that. But it's been quite a long journey, and it still becomes absolutely terrible when Carolyn is gone. So, but I wanted to say that I got to know Betty in New York. I got to know Carolyn in New York. I have another friend called Irene who's been mentioned, who I've been able to stay with in New York many times. And so the deepening of my friendship with Carolyn definitely happened here in New York. And I remember in particular, she used to love going to movies, and we went to see the movie Chirac, which is a Spike Lee film about Chicago and the deaths of young men through shootings in Chicago. And that film never got to Australia. So that was really important. Carolyn would always point me to something that I needed to look at, and we'd go to the movies together. And so I'm at this point in time in our lives, I feel like we're being forced to look at the story of our lives and our relationships to each other. And that's a really important part of everything for me. And I just wanted to show you one photograph that I happen to have on my desk of Carolyn and Alessandro at the time that I met them at the Filmmakers Co-op. And look how gorgeous and bright and beautiful Carolyn is. So that's my little acknowledgement to Carolyn now. And thank you so much for letting me speak. And thank you very much for arranging this meeting.
Thank you, Sandy. I don't see any other hands up. I do now. Jill, welcome again. And please maybe introduce yourself before your remarks.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Jill Godmelo, old friend of Carolyn's. We were both filmmakers and did a lot of work together. She lived in my building, 135 Hudson Street, for many years in Emily Rothschild's apartment. And that's where I got to know her well and admire her. In the end, I was the one who convinced her to put 2 laws up at Facets Multimedia so that the rest of us could see it. For years, she and I guess Alessandro had insisted that to watch that film, you had to be sitting cross-legged on the floor, and that was essentially important in taking in the film. And I guess it was. I never watched it that way, but I did convince her finally to put the film online at Facets Multimedia, and I'm glad I did. We did a lot of work together to get it ready to be presented that way. And I saw her a number of times after she got sick. I was still living at 135 Hudson, and it was gruesome to watch it. We had disagreed. I also had breast cancer, and we had disagreed violently over the correct treatment. She had her own way, I had mine. I survived, she didn't. But what can I say? I'll miss her forever and admire her forever. And goodbye, Carolyn. We love you. Ciao.
Thank you, Jill. I certainly share that feeling. Oh, Sandy, I see you have your hand up. Is that your hand up again?
Yes, sorry.
Very welcome. Go ahead.
I just forgot to say something. That is that you might want to look up a film that's just been made and released in Sydney, Australia, and that's called Senses of Cinema. And it's the history of the Filmmakers Co-op in Sydney. And it's got a wonderful interview in it with Carolyn and Alessandra, but Carolyn does all the talking, totally articulate. And so it was amazing to see that after she had passed away, to see the film. It's only just been shown in Sydney, and it's really, it's made by Tom Zabricki and John Hughes. So have a look at it if you can.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak before we say goodbye? I certainly want to thank everybody who spoke tonight and for attending tonight, with a special thank you again to the people who helped me organize the tribute. And maybe a little extra special thank you to Alex for taking care of some of the housekeeping, which would have distracted me considerably during the tribute. So I will follow up with the recording, and obviously feel free to contact me or anybody else regarding the availability, let's say, of the recording or any other kinds of tributes that may come to pass in the future about Carolyn, since I think those of us that knew her fairly well, I knew her fairly well, I didn't know her nearly as well as some of the others here, but I certainly miss her greatly. And I'm, you know, it was tough. I actually was going to say in my remarks something about her resistance to the institution of medicine, And given what Jill said a moment ago, I'd like to say that, as someone else said earlier, I don't remember who, she far outlived the expectations, I think, that the doctors had given her. And I always assumed that was because of her particular commitment to finding and designing her own forms of therapy. And, you know, I think it was a combination of traditional medical science, but also traditional medicine of all sorts. So, of course, we miss her, but she'd been sick for a long time, as we knew. And she really, it was a heroic effort to live as long as she did. So again, thanks to everybody. We really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to contacts with some of you in the future.
Jonathan, could we all unmute and just, since we celebrated so much tonight about community, could we all unmute and just say good night to each other and hear our voices together?
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night.
It was wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.
Bye.
Night.
Bye.